Welcome back to Final Fantasy Flawless, where we left off with only one major boss left to fail, and, as I'm sure you can expect, it was one of the hardest. Previous parts are linked in the description, as well as the unedited fight in full. Build details are covered in Act 1, with a slight change of Giga Flare which replaced Ignition, and with the final boss not giving any experience, the XP boost has also been replaced in preparation for our final encounter with Bahamut's Mercy, reducing Giga Flare's cooldown by 12 seconds. I assume at this stage you're probably aware, but as a final heads up, from here on out there's going to be final boss spoilers. You have been warned. Our gear is equipped, side quests have been turned in, and the hunt board's cleared in full. It's time for one final Flawless. As you'd expect from a Final Fantasy final boss, there's a hefty amount of cinematic content for the finale. From the start of the stage through to the end credits, you're looking at roughly 69 minutes of content. Fortunately, a large chunk of that is the opening cinematics, and whilst the Ultimate Prime segment can't be skipped, the rest of them can be, as well as being able to save just before the actual fight. That said, the fight itself has numerous cinematics and clashes throughout the whole thing, which can be used to your advantage both with ability cooldowns and skipping moves. The prime example of this is Phase 1, where both Judgment Bolt and Giga Flare normally do just about enough damage combined to trigger the first cutscene, and whilst Giga Flare recharges in time, Judgment Bolt is still down. However, by opening with Judgment Bolt and delaying the use of Giga Flare, whilst this opening stage lasts a bit longer, it allows both abilities to be up after the cutscene, as well as getting past the 50% stagger, meaning less time is spent on the second segment overall. Phase 1's arguably biggest run killer was the first attack Ultima uses, a flurry of projectiles that usually allowed for 3 dodge counters, but had some variants where incorrect timing or bad luck with projectile spread meant missing a precision dodge and getting hit. But being so early made it so there's little time lost to a run when screwing it up. Judgment Bolt could even be held off until after the first dodge even, to give you time to get a proper look at where the projectiles are headed, a technique I opted to use on a few later runs. Following the projectiles, there's 2 follow-up moves, an aerial dive that can be rook countered after a short delay, or a sweeping charge where I, for the first time, tried to actually put the Shiva's dodge permafrost to use, providing an opening to get a couple of abilities off before the next attack chain. There's a few moves at Ultima's disposal. A flurry of 3 in quick succession, 2 large ball orbs like those in Stage 3 of the Necron fight, and Break, an AoE with a couple of extra circles around the edge. The hitbox seems slightly larger than the ground indicator, but it's not a hard one to dodge. However, it is the shortest, so often I just use regular combos whenever it came up. The other 2 provide better openings, though the timings are slightly different on them when it comes to permafrost, as the triple flurry will unfreeze just before the next strike, meaning only one ability, or a full 4-hit combo, can be safely used before Ultima thaws, whilst the orbs are slower and have a lingering hitbox, so I could get 2 skills off safely, but using Giga Flare before the thawing started would have the beam end before the lingering hitbox faded. Both moves are followed up with a teleport away and flare, which has spiraling projectiles that meet in the center and explode. Shiva gives plenty of time to get out, and if I missed my freezes, there's a decent opening for Giga Flare here instead, as well as a lot of recovery to take advantage of to get that 50% stagger before the cutscene. There is technically more to the stage, as it loops after the flare, though instead of flare the second time round it's holy, another AoE, but instead of having to dodge carefully on your way out, there's extra strips of light that shoot from the edges, that appear later than the initial AoE marker. However, holding off long enough to trigger it wasn't worth it in most cases, both thanks to having to dodge the projectiles again, and Ultima's health being hard capped at 50%, so there wasn't a significant amount of extra damage to be had by trying to get a full stagger in. After the cutscene, Ultima's pattern is a bit more hard-coded, starting off with a ground rift to move off of, and Ultima teleporting close to use the double orb attack, followed up swiftly with the named attack Ultima. Like most moves that suck you in, Shiva's dodge makes it easily avoidable, and in my perfect runs, the downtime afterwards was enough to get the stagger and finish off Ultima before any other moves could be used. Not all runs went so smoothly, however, and especially in cases where I missed the 50% stagger before the cutscene, you'll likely encounter a plethora of extra moves on top of the ones already seen before the cutscene. The most common one encountered is where Ultima flies rapidly around, firing projectiles in 3 waves of 3. Due to the motion, range counters on the first 2 tended to miss most of the time, though the third landed consistently as Ultima had stopped moving by that point. Smite would also surface every now and then, a named attack where Ultima will disappear before teleporting next to you, and very shortly after blasting you with magic. Technically it's a 2-hit combo, though dodging, or abusing invulnerability, nullifies the follow-up. The timing is quite tight, though Shiva, as always, helps massively with it. Finally, there's Meteor, which functions just like Behemoth's attack, and so long as you mind your step, it shouldn't pose much of an issue. And like Ultima, provides a decent opening afterwards, usually being the point at which I'd finish the phase in a suboptimal run. I'd say Phase 2 is probably the hardest segment of this fight, or at least the one that gives you the most opportunities to mess up. The opening move isn't set, allowing for a fair number of ways the fight could play out. Generally my plan was to wait a second to see whether Ultima Risen warps away, and if not, then it's a good chance to use Spit Flare. There's 3 different types of charge attack. The least common one is a pretty standard charge attack that takes longer to initiate and is followed up by a large spiral of orbs outwards from Ultima, which if you dodge through or brimstone counter, it gives you enough of a window to get a full backdraft combo off. The other 2 charges go into flurries. There's enough time for a hit and burst between each hit of the flurries, and you essentially want to keep an eye on Ultima Risen as they'll distinctly flash before each attack, which is the ideal time to dodge. There is a slight difference between the 2 flurries in that one is 3 hits whilst the other 4, and the way you can visually tell is based on the opening strike. The flurry of 3 begins with a spin attack, whilst the flurry of 4 opens with a kick. Both of these were usually followed up with Aureola, where Ultima warps back and releases periodic bursts of 4 rings, providing some easy dodge counters, usually allowing for a stagger by the end of the attack. Stellar Zistun is another named attack that will occasionally be used, shooting 2 beams from either side and spinning. There's 2 full rotations on them, but dodging in one direction can position you so that a third is close to hitting you, so either be careful with your movement, or use it to your advantage, getting a third count hit in. In the event Ultima warps away, you'll be attacked from range with a Mega Flare Volley and an Orb, though the order which they're used can vary, and sometimes they were used twice, before either using the Orb Spiral Charge or Smite. Smite in this phase is effectively a single-shot version of Antistrophe, the attack Ultima Risen most frequently used after the 50% stagger point. After a short delay, Ultima will teleport away, reappear next to you, and fire off a large beam 3 times in succession, which you can dodge to the side and counter effectively, before waiting for the visual flash to dodge the next beam. At the end of each full stagger, Ultima will cast the Rapture, and whilst it's great fun to dodge through, it's high risk for little reward, with your safest option being to wildfire dash and outrange it entirely, or use Spitflare's invulnerability just before initial impact, which allows you to go straight into dodges for the remainder of the Rapture, assuming it hasn't finished already. Most of the time, this put Ultima Risen's health around 50%, causing them to start the Purgatorium phase, though in some instances they'd go back into an attack sequence instead, allowing for another stagger phase first, and finding that the damage caps out for this stage around 25% health. Purgatorium is a press the attack segment, meaning we have a fully linear experience, It starts out with 4 Aureola rings, after which you can light speed and get a hit in before orbs shoot outward. A good opportunity for a brimstone counter. Orbs will spawn 2 more times, with one always directly pointing at you, though you can get 2 to 3 hits in before moving slightly to the left or right to dodge them as they spawn, getting a full backdraft combo in before the Stellar Ziston spin and attack. Spitflare is normally up by this point, and so I dodge counter the first spin before spitflaring through the second, which provides just enough time to get a heat rush into full backdraft combo so long as you don't burst the first hit. After this, we're pushed back and have to dodge through 3 Mega Flare volleys before another Stellar Ziston spin. The Mega Flare volleys here caused some issues during my attempts, as every now and then I'd get hit by a single projectile after a perfect dodge, and I was never fully able to get to the bottom of the cause. It may have been the counter input was dropped, or a small gap between the dodge and counter window where I'm vulnerable to hits, that would infrequently be struck thanks to some bad luck on the Mega Flare spread. Regardless, when we close in on Ultima again, the new sequence of orbs faces us, forming a ring around the arena and firing off sequentially. Brimstone is used to counter the first instance again, though the second and third times are dodged through. I tend to avoid backdraft finishes at this stage, as well sometimes they'd work out with their invulnerability eating the orbs. It wasn't as consistent as I'd like, and we're not so pressed for time that the extra DPS was necessary. Stellar Ziston follows up the sequence again, though unlike the first time I can only get a double hit backdraft in, and Spitflare has a little longer to come off of cooldown, requiring us to dodge both passes before using it. Once I got the patterns down, I'd break Purgatorium here, or within the first couple of charge shots after the pushback, though the final portion of this stage's rotation begins with Pulsar, which is the opener for the next stage, so I'll explain it there, and a set of orbs from every angle at once, making it the most ideal move to Brimstone counter. Ultima is put into a stagger state immediately after you break Purgatorium, so you immediately get some extra damage in before the follow-up Rapture and Pulsar, where Ultima fires 6 beams outwards and then spins around. I'd go for a handful of charge shots whilst Pulsar was charging up, but once the spinning started, I'd pay close attention to the beams and go for dodge counters when they would come into close proximity. A fair number of runs were ended from dodging too soon in anticipation of a beam crossing my path, only for the angle to change, missing the dodge window and getting hit during the recovery instead, so it's a move to stay vigilant with. Beyond this point, the fight will go back into the same combat loop as the start, with the addition of Daimokairos, a beam attack that starts out like Antistrophe, but the beam lasts longer and will eventually be split in 2, moving outwards, requiring an additional dodge and making it safer to maintain some distance from Ultima compared to Antistrophe. It shouldn't take too long to whittle down the last portion of Ultima's health, and with Ultima Risen Felled, we move on to the final phase, Ultimalius. Phase 3 has a lot of moves, but they're rotated with each cutscene so it's not too bad, and the length of said cutscenes means each one gives us a free ult charge, which in turn basically lets us skip Stage 2. Unfortunately, Stage 2 is probably one of the easiest movesets, but honestly that's a small price to pay. Ultimalia still has the double orb and triple strike melee attacks from Phase 1, though these only come up sporadically compared to the main named attacks. Fulmen and Fulgur is the opener, conjuring large circles of lightning to carefully step between as Ultimalius barrages us with their other attacks. A charge attack is up first among these, which ideally would be permafrosted. This was followed up by either some of Ultimalius' regular attacks, or more commonly Euroclydon, the fast flurry of Garuda Claws Benedict used. Getting the 50% stagger would normally lead to another Fulmen and Fulgur, this time opened with Divine Embrace, pulling you towards Ultimalius but dealing no damage, which in many cases made it desirable to get hit by, as there's a lot more space to move around them, making it easier to dodge the follow-up. The final attack in this stage Ultimalius would use is Cataclysm, a titanic fist that slams the ground and sends out sequential shockwaves from the centre. You may have noticed a lack of Raging Fist counters in this fight, and that's mainly because most moves weren't safely countered with it. This move, however, was the big exception, as it consistently was able to counter the initial hit, and Rook's Gambit was perfectly timed afterwards for the shockwave. Whereas Rook's Gambit to dodge the initial strike would leave me in a precarious mid-air position for the shockwave. This move was essentially the gatekeeper of the runs that made it through Phase 2, hence why I opted to keep Raging Fists purely to counter it, when other options would likely be better overall, such as another ult given the free cutscene cooldowns. Ultimalius also has Hugo Kupka's parry mechanic in this stage, which is something to consider when getting the 50% stagger, and it would be followed up with either Euroclydon or Cataclysm. My damage tended to be high enough to hit the cap during the stagger window, however stagger damage is carried over to the next stage, so once I hit that cap I'd wait until the end of the stagger window to use Scarlet Cyclone and Gouge to get an earlier stagger in Stage 2. Stage 2 replaces the Garuda, Titan and Ramuh moves with those of Bahamut, Shiva and Odin, opening with Exaflare, the Flare Breath from Bahamut. Though the ground it touches explodes at the end as well, so you have to make sure to get off it. This is normally followed up with Boreal Rhapsody, Shiva's Raining Ice attack, and then Severance, or, as you probably better know it, the Lord's Measure. In my successful run, however, Ultimalius was staggered after the Exaflare, and the damage dealt was already enough to move on to the next stage. Stage 3 has Ultimalius unleash the full extent of their power, limit breaking as the stage begins in earnest, and shedding the past icon abilities for a moveset mostly resembling Phase 1, with some extra power, plus a handful of Phoenix-fueled named attacks. We start off with the return of the Ground Rift, which Ultimalius now chains 3 times. Smite, Flare, Holy and Meteor all return, mostly unchanged from before, with the latter 3 providing significant openings after use. Break now has additional circles spawning outside of the main one, making Shiva dodging less effective as you'll want to find a safe spot instead of just getting away from the initial spot. The Flying Charge also leaves residual wind slashes that alternate in direction, with line indicators for which way they'll go. These didn't cause any issues across my various attempts, but are an extra thing to consider as Ultimalius continues pressing the attack. Empyrosis and Ashes to Ashes are the new named moves. The former has a small amount of suction at point blank range, but with enough of a window between it and the impact to get out of the way before Ultimalius lands, sending out a shockwave from the impact zone that can be jumped over. Ashes to Ashes, meanwhile, is a 2-pronged attack, starting out with a flurry of fireballs to be dodge countered through, then a landing impact resemblant of the final hit of Deliverance, which could be safely rook countered or giga flared through. Flames of Creation signifies the final portion of this fight, starting with a massive fireball to dodge out of the way of, pushing you back when it explodes, and causing numerous blue flame explosions to start spawning around the arena. Ultimalius follows this up with Ashes to Ashes once again, which can be dodged in the same way as normal, though a blue flame usually spawns during the descent below you, exploding shortly after impact, requiring some extra care with your timing. From here, Ultimalius will use Flurry into Flare, after which the blue flames cease spawning, and in all likelihood you'll either stagger Ultimalius or have dealt enough damage to trigger the next cutscene, leading to the final stage. If, that is, you even want to call it a stage. With abilities off cooldown, Ultimalius is weak enough to defeat before making a single attack, and the few attacks left at their disposal are their basic attacks, albeit slightly slower than normal, and Ultima, which they don't even have the energy to finish casting.
The world you seek is but a fantasy!
The only fantasy here is yours. And we shall be its final witness.
And thus
I said,
did our journey end.
it's over!
Ultimalius is defeated. The final Medal of Valour is ours. And yet, even with our flawless, undamaged body, it's not enough to contain the full extent of Ultima's power. But whilst we have it, we can use it to see Ultima's legacy consigned to the flames. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Hopefully you've enjoyed it as much as I did. I have a few ideas for some more challenges to do in Final Fantasy XVI, but after putting so much time and energy into the flawless runs, I'm probably going to take a break before coming back to it, especially with Armored Core and Blasphemous 2 around the corner. I do have the S-Rank hunts all flawless, which was initially going to be part of this video, though I ended up deciding it was better to have this fight be its own thing, given how magnanimous it is. So that will be in the works for the immediate future, after which we'll see where things go. After all, the world's ours now. Ours to do with as we please. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.